working for more years than I care to admit, about 35 in this mostly in travel demand modeling. In fact, the first activity-based model I worked on was for Portland Metro back when Keith Lawton was there in the mid-90s. And I also work on a lot of our survey research. We'll be working on the Oregon statewide travel survey the next couple of years. And so I'll be talking, this was the survey that RSG sort of did on our own money. And just to keep track of the trends during the pandemic, it's a nationally representative repeated cross-sectional survey. And to date, we've fielded it 9 times from May 2020 to September 2021, which was last month. So it's an online survey, first administered in May 2020, with a new wave every 2 months or so, about 3,000 people per wave. We use a national online panel that we've used for a lot of projects in the past that are pretty high quality data, called Full Circle, and then we reweight the data. So the questionnaire has over 100 questions, which have changed a little bit over the waves, but these are the main topics we look at. I'm going to be focusing on teleworking today and travel replacement a little bit, but we also have about all these other things, including about changes in employment, which the last presentation was on. So we do weighting into 5 different regions of the country, and with both household level and person level controls from the 2019 ACS PUMS. So each wave is weighted to the same targets, and we use some targets that are combinations of things like race and ethnicity and income, or gender by whether there's children or not in the household, and other things, so we can get it single parent households. So now we have over 27,000 over the 9 waves. The weighting doesn't change things too much. They do a pretty good job at getting unweighted data that, at least along race, ethnicity, and age, is pretty close to the actual distributions. By income and education, we have to change things a little bit. So this shows the timing of the waves with the arrows relative to how severe the pandemic has been in the 5 different regions in terms of people per million hospitalized with COVID. And you see there's the 4 waves there, and they've differed a lot by parts of the country. And I think right now, already in September, and even since then, it's been hospitalization rates have been going down in most of the country. But when we look at the data, we see there are responses in different parts of the country that sort of correlate with what's happening in terms of the severity of the number of cases there. So I'm only going to show a few. I mean, we could show hundreds of slides from this, but I'll just focus on a few today because of time that I think are very relevant. So teleworking is big, and so this is the average days per week people report teleworking, and we look at it by industry type. And pre-COVID is over here on the right, which we asked people like a typical week before March, whatever, 2020. And then, so you see in the retail and hospitality industry, working from home has stayed low the whole pandemic. Raised up a little bit at first. Some jobs in that industry, people can work from home, but the it stayed low. Same for health services, has stayed pretty low. Also construction and industry, the yellow line. So those are kind of the essential jobs. The high one, of course, is professional services, which started out as the highest in terms pre-COVID, but is still, according to our data, like 3 days per week on average. And other jobs in there. The real outlier here is education, teaching, which went way up at first and over time has come down to be an essential service again as schools have opened, and now is about as low as it was pre-COVID almost. So an interesting thing, so we asked people who are working from home during each wave how many days per week they would like to keep working from home. And that average hasn't changed much over time or across industry groups. It's about 4 days per week. Of course, that's the people who are still working from home, which changes over time. But then we ask how likely your employer would be to allow you to work that desired number of days from home. With an average, it's an average score where 1 is very unlikely, 5 is very likely. For most industries, especially education, there's kind of a self-sorting going on. The people who can't work from home are going back to work, but the people who are still working from home are pretty confident that they can keep doing it and will be allowed to. Say maybe they have the type of jobs where that's available. The real outlier there is the professional services, where since May 21, which is about the time where most people were getting vaccinated, people who are still working from home are becoming less optimistic that they can remain working from home their desired number of days, although that's still above neutral, that score, so still fairly optimistic. And another thing we found there is that we also asked people how long until they think their offices will reopen, the people who are still working from home. And right after, it's not shown here, but right after the May 21, people in the professional services thought that their offices would be opening in the next month or so, a lot of them. And that turned out not to happen because of the Delta wave and different things. So now the estimates are going back up again. A lot of people don't think their offices will be opening very soon. So, or at least the people who are still working from home. So there's a lot still more we can unpack in that data over time. So we look at the frequency of how often people are using their cars. And the number one variable in that, at least during the initial months of COVID, was whether they're working from home or not. And you see that people who are teleworking every day use their cars even less frequently than people who weren't even employed, their green line. And people who commuted all their work days, within a few months, their travel was back up to, their frequency of car use was back up to pre-COVID levels and has even gone above that now. But you see that all of the groups have increased their frequency of car use quite a bit, which kind of agrees with what Becky was showing. And although this is just frequency, not actual traffic. And the difference between these lines is groups has shrunk. So that suggests that all the groups are driving more often for non-commute purposes, since this segmentation sort of covers the commute purpose. So I'll just show one more slide about shopping and meals. This is one of the reasons people are traveling. Two of the reasons people are traveling more often are going to restaurants. So eating meals in restaurants went down a lot, and now it's back up even above getting food to take out or deliveries. And also over here, shopping in grocery stores went down some compared to pre-COVID, now is back pretty high. These pre-COVID estimates might be a little low, but the interesting thing is that if deliveries versus going to restaurants and stores were actually substitutes, you would expect these lower lines to be going down as people go back, but that's not happening. They keep going up, which suggests to me that people have changed their behavior. So delivery services have there's a lot more of them. They're offering better deals. And so people may think, well, I'm still going to get some of my groceries delivered, and there's other ones that I want to go out and buy at the store. So they're doing both, which isn't too good for traffic because you get people going to the stores and people and trucks delivering things to them. The same for meals. So, and we looked at correlations between these things, and they're always positive. So there doesn't really seem to be any substitution going on there. So that's a question that I'll bring back up for discussion later. But right now, I'll go on to our other panelists, if I can stop sharing my screen here. Wait. Let's see, is Ram here yet? Yes, he is. Okay. So Ram, if you can share your screen, and I'll give you a quick introduction.
Will do. Thank you. Will do. Thank you. So let me make this work. Oh, so I think for me to share, you have to stop sharing. But
oh, I stopped sharing. I don't know.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Let's see. Oh, wait a minute here. Just have to get to the page with your, there we go. Okay, so Ram Pendyala is a professor of transportation systems at the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment at Arizona State University, and is the director of TomNet, a US DOT funded Tier 1 University Transportation Center. His expertise lies in a study of travel behavior and understanding the role of various factors in shaping human mobility choices. Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Ram.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I just want to say that this is an honor and a privilege to share some of the work we've been doing, trying to understand the implications of COVID for the future of travel and human activities and mobility choices. Do pardon me, I'm a little bit under the weather today, so but I'll try to get through without much of an issue. So I do want to start off by saying that I'm merely the messenger today. The real heavy lift and all the work has really been done by an amazingly glorious team across Arizona State University and University of Illinois, Chicago. The faculty members involved, Dr. Deborah Salon, Kuros Mohammedian, Sybil Deribel, and all of our fantastic and wonderful students. So really all credit and all work really goes to the glorious team. In fact, I couldn't quite fit everybody on one slide, so I just thought this would cover it and acknowledge what they have done. So with that, let me just say the COVID Future Survey is trying to measure respondent attitudes, lifestyle, work from home, mode use and travel patterns, e-shopping, air travel. And in each of the surveys, we ask, what they have done, what they're doing now, and what do they expect to do or experience once the pandemic is no longer a threat. And obviously, there's just a tremendous amount of interest with respect to this question as to what COVID means for our future. And there's lots of statistics and white papers out there. So the COVID Future Survey, I encourage you to check covidfuture.org. It's an online longitudinal survey, pretty much implemented in Qualtrics. We have recruited folks through a combination strategy. So it's an online Qualtrics panel. We bought an email database from Infogroup. So, 500,000 emails, addresses, and randomly just, a random email database and just blasted out our survey to this database. And then a convenient sample, which may include some of you, our friends and family and colleagues and so on. And so it is a nationwide survey, but you can see how in the figure we have some amount of heaviness with respect to the sample in the larger populated states and in Arizona, simply because, well, we're here. And so we really hit Arizona kind of in a big way, and we're able to get a large number of responses for Arizona. So we have 3 waves of data collection planned. Wave 1, we got nearly 10,000 responses. It went from April to October of 2020. The second wave, so in other words, in each wave, we're just going back to the same people who responded in the previous wave. So we sent out again to the 9,900 folks for wave 2, and we got the 3,100 responses. And wave 2 went from November to May. So our waves are kind of extended waves during which actually the pandemic has evolved and protocols have changed and so on. But we do know the date of each response. And so you can do some filtering if you want to see what's going on with people, pre-vaccination versus post-vaccination and things like that. We did ensure that there is a 6-month gap between people answering wave 1 and wave 2. So somebody who answered in October 2020, they were not invited for wave 2 until late spring of 2021. So we always maintain at least a 6-month gap between wave 1 and wave 2 responses. The wave 1 data has been released. There are some publications. We also have short papers in findings. And I encourage you to check those out. The wave 1 data is available on the ASU Dataverse. Just go to covidfuture.org and you can access the 10,000 records, raw data, all cleaned and weighted. So wave 3 is in progress. We started deploying October, right, just now. I mean, so wave 3 is just underway. It's about 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the logic chain that you have to follow through the survey. We're planning some reminder protocols, and you'll notice that we're having some promising responses. So we've sent, 8,000 plus responses, and so far, we actually have a very good response rate, I would think, for a panel. So folks are kind of sticking with us. So far, we have 1,700 responses. And again, these are all folks who at least answered wave. So will behaviors and activities evolve substantially into the new normal? Some thought leaders say yes, while others think not. I myself, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, was more in the not category. But as the pandemic has extended and gone on forever and ever, I feel less and less that is the case. And I do think that there will be a permanent evolution into a new normal. The question is, to what extent? We asked a broad question in wave 1, where we just said, the pandemic has forced us to do lots of things differently, work from home, go to school from home, have things delivered, stay at home, et cetera, not travel, do everything through Zoom meetings and so on. And we just asked a general question. Would you like to continue any of these new ways of living after COVID-19 is no longer a threat? And you can see about a third say yes, they'd like to continue at least some aspects of this life. 25% no, and 43% are were kind of on the fence. But again, all of wave 1 is from 2020. So, so it is clearly a year old now. Now, when we look at these surveys and consider what's going on with their behaviors, we do have to consider changes in social demographics. This is just an example to show, again, this is from wave 1, we actually found nearly a 30%, 30+% indicate that their income changed and changed downward. So we do feel that we need to account for these types of sociodemographic effects when understanding what's happening with behaviors over time. Here's the socioeconomic distribution of weighted and unweighted panel samples, very similar to Mark. We pretty much divided the country into regions and then weighted with respect to household and person characteristics. Here I'm showing the person characteristics. And you can see that in our unweighted, we actually have more old people who the raw sample. This is the stayer sample, by the way. So more of the older folks, we do have slightly more orientation towards females, more educated. Employment is not all that off, but then minorities are underrepresented, Hispanic and non-white. And so we did have to do weighting to account for what's happening with this stayer sample.
Can you wrap up in a few minutes, Ram?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So this is the option to work from home, and you can see that option to work from home from pre-pandemic all the way to post-pandemic. What I really wanted to show here is that the expectation of having the option to work from home is really dependent on income and education. So you can actually see these equity issues showing up quite a bit, but nearly half, on average, nearly half expect to have the option to at least work from home partially, not necessarily fully. Here's the work from home from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, and post-pandemic is expected. And you can see from the no option, you can see that nearly 50% don't expect to have that option in the future. You can see some folks unemployed went back into employment. Frequent telecommuting definitely increases from 16 to 34% infrequent, which is once a week or less. So once a week or less kind of goes down from the pre-pandemic, and there's a pickup of frequent. Here's the travel mode, again, as you would expect. So private vehicles saw so just not commuting really saw the big increase, both in wave 1 and wave 2. But in the post-pandemic, there seems to be a lot of thought about returning to the private vehicle as a mode to work. Now, transit will pick back up a little bit. Transit at 10.9%, here it went down to 3.5 and 4.6, but it could come back to about 7.5%, so not 100% recovery, but hopefully better than what it is now. I'm going to share this presentation. I won't go through some of this. We asked people in-depth questions as to why they wanted to decrease or increase work from home. And you can see the reasons, more distractions at home, more comfortable workspace. The big one is no commuting. So the absence of the commute has been welcome to a lot of folks. Here is number of days per week that people expect to commute. So this is number of commute days. And you can see before COVID, 4+ days a week, you're going into the workplace. And then wave 1 and wave 2, not a lot of difference, but you can see this little bump at 5 days a week. And then here's post-COVID. Here's what people expect, a lot of 5 days a week, but then you have a lot of zeros and somewhere in between as well. So kind of 3-ish days a week in the future. Here is non-grocery shopping. Again, a lot of evolution. Because this is a panel sample, we can really see how these folks have evolved and expect to evolve with respect to their online non-grocery shopping. Here are the reasons. So again, saving time seems to be quite a big aspect. Here's air travel. Here's mode use. And so you can see among former users, so people who used to do personal flying and business flying, you can see the blue represents less. That is, in the post-pandemic, do you expect to do less of it? And you can see business is considerably less compared to personal. Here is walking and bicycling. And again, former users versus non-users. And you can see former users really picking up walking and biking. So that is quite promising. So again, here is changes in air travel. And you can see for business, the big reason is I realized I could conduct my meetings by conference call and video conference, and I expect a reduced budget for travel. So that essentially explains what's going on with air travel. Here is telemedicine, and you can see telemedicine picking up. This is during the pandemic and what they expect to do in the future. And you can see there's quite a bit of telemedicine possibilities in the future. Attitudes do make a big difference. So attitudes towards COVID, attitudes towards the pandemic, attitudes towards the economy and the disruptions actually affect how people respond to the pandemic. So what might our future look like? Can cities support allocating more street space for alternative modes and outdoor dining? Certainly a lot of interest there. And so will these expectations become actual change? Time will tell, but we hope this data will be useful from that standpoint. Thank you, Mark, for indulging. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ram. We'll have one more speaker before we open up to questions, if we have time. So next speaker is Giovanni Circella from, he's the Honda Distinguished Scholar for New Mobility Studies and the Director of the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program at the University of California, Davis, and a Senior Research Engineer at the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology. So he's got a long telecommute there, all right, long commute. Dr. Circella is leading a major research effort on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we're going to hear something about. He's the chair of the Transportation TRB Standing Committee on Information and Communication Technology and Transportation, and a member of the Travel Behaviors and Values Committee. The rest you can read in the agenda. So Giovanni, if you can share your screen, that would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark, and good morning, everybody. So let me attempt to share my screen. I noticed while Ram was speaking that I started to have a little bit of internet problems. Sometimes the voice of Ram was breaking up for me. I hope you will be able to hear me.
Yeah, maybe if you turn the video off during your presentation, that might help.
While I talk okay, perfect. So first of all, like Ram, I need to acknowledge a long team of long list of names in my presentation and beyond. I'm listing here three main colleagues. Summer Jorgensen, she's an extremely smart PhD student that's been actually doing a lot of the analysis in the slides that we'll present today. Jay Malik, that is really working, another PhD student, finishing his work now at UC Davis, very smart and really doing a lot of the reporting work for this project. And Michelle Young, that who is now an assistant professor in Toronto, but that has been co-leading this research with me for quite a bit of time over the past year and a half. I have many more names that I will list in the final slide at the end. And this project really that we've been leading has really been trying to investigate the temporary versus long-term components of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on transportation. So a lot of things in common with what Ram and Mark were presenting before, but also some slight differences. So somehow I think the three presentations complement each other rather well to really discuss what we have learned so far about the impacts of the pandemic. So I don't need to really express the interest that we had in investigating the impacts of the pandemic on travel behavior. The excellent presentations today have really shown a lot of the changes that have been happening in transportation during the pandemic, including the substantial rebound of a lot of the vehicle miles travel that have come back recently during 2021. However, one thing that I want to point is that as some of the presentation has shown, the spatio-temporal distribution of trips and the distribution by mode has really changed quite a bit. And the use of passively collected data is very useful to really try to capture these patterns. But really, in our study, we really wanted to understand who is responsible for these changes and really how the likelihood that these changes might extend in the future might really affect the future of transportation and the use of the infrastructure. And so for this study, somehow we were a little bit, I don't want to use the word lucky, because we're talking about a national tragedy with more than 700,000 people that died. So let's say that we had some conditions that made our research easier. I don't want to use the word luck in this tragedy. And the reason is that we could build on some previous data collection that we conducted right before the pandemic. So in 2018 and 2019, with funding from Caltrans, the National Center for Sustainable Transportation and the US DOT, we actually launched two large data collections. One was in California, the other one focused on 8 large metro areas of the United States. And so we had quite a bit of data that was collected before the beginning of the pandemic. Of course, at that time, we had no idea that a major pandemic would have struck the country. But really, this provides some real benchmark and information about all the variables that we are interested in studying, including household organization, telecommuting, travel choices, use of e-shopping, and so on, right before the pandemic. And so during the pandemic, we launched a first round of data collection in spring 2020. We targeted in particular data collections in 15 regions of the United States and 2 regions in Canada, 2020. And so somehow we built this longitudinal component of the data with the third data point when possible for the same respondents, but also we refreshed the sample, adding additional respondents at each wave. And we just completed an additional round of data collection, so it would be round 4 in spring, summer 2021. The results are not included yet in this presentation because we are still processing them. We have more than 11,000 respondents from this round of data collection. So some of them are actually the same respondents from the past, some are not. And we will plan to continue this round of data collection again in next year. So we will not have another round in this fall, but we will have another one in spring, summer 2022, exactly 1 year after this one, to really see how patterns evolve during the recovery after the pandemic. We use a mixed sampling approach, so a little bit of structure about the database. We started with these respondents that were largely coming from the use of an online opinion panel, as well as a stratified random sample of individuals in California that were really invited to their home address. So we printed invitations and questionnaires, we sent them to their home in 2018, 2019. During spring 2020, we resampled as much as possible of the previous respondents. We had about 1,300 respondents that are the same from the previous round. We also invited thousands of new respondents with this new round of data collection. And I need to mention, in this round, we largely used online opinion panels, mainly because of the need to go in the field very quickly when the pandemic hit. In fall 2020, winter 2021, we came back with another large round of data collection. Some of the respondents are the same. Again, we included new recruitment of new respondents. And now we're working still at organizing all the massive amount of data that we collected in spring, summer 2021. At this round, we use all the previous methods of data collection, using a convenience sample, an online opinion panel, using the longitudinal component, inviting again the same respondents from the previous ways, but also we're doing a stratified random sample of California households. So we mailed 60,000 invitations in the USPS mail. Of these, 50,000 were invitations to do the survey online, and 10,000 were invitations to do the survey with a printed questionnaire that we mailed, both in English and Spanish. So we really try to do our best efforts to reduce all sampling biases and all issues that we have usually, in which minorities tend to participate less in studies, or we have, for example, an overrepresentation of individuals that are able to telework and work remotely. We will come back to this topic in my last slide in this presentation. The survey content was pretty much consistent in all different versions of the surveys that we used. So we have major sections collecting information about attitudes and preferences, use of technology, adoption of telework, work activities, household organization, online shopping, in-person shopping, travel choices, the use of new travel modes, but also information, detailed information about vehicle ownership and changes in vehicle ownership. We're actually developing vehicle transaction models to really estimate who has bought a vehicle during the pandemic and what type of vehicle they bought, and whether this was an expansion of the number of vehicles in the household or it was a replacement of a vehicle already in the household, and also propensity towards the new alternative fuel vehicles and so on. And of course, household individual social demographics to really link this information to who is making these changes. I want to point in a summary slide some key findings, and then I hope I will have a few minutes to talk more extensively about some of these. So one of these, as Mark and Ram has discussed extensively, there was a major shift into remote work during the pandemic. This was particularly strong among higher income and higher education workers. Our data showed that about 25% of respondents expect to continue to work remotely after the pandemic is over, with the frequency that is higher, so more often than they did before the pandemic. We can return this about really discussing how these findings can be generalized to the population because of that big potential issues that we overrepresent with online surveys, those that are able to work from home. I also want to point that our data has been showing that while there was a reduction in use by all modes during the peak of the pandemic with an increase in walking and on-commute travel, one thing that was very concerning is that approximately 1/3 of those that reduced the use of transit have massively switched to driving. So that is actually something that we're trying to will hold in the future, is somehow a concerning issue, because if habits are formed as those individuals don't return to transit, it might just be easy for them to stay using their private vehicle. In shopping, there was a big increase in shopping adoption, and one thing that is very important, a little bit like Mark was mentioning, that e-shopping is here to stay, there was an expansion of the user base among non-traditional users. Our models of using e-shopping show that e-shopping increased also among non-traditional e-shoppers. This includes older individuals that don't live in urban areas. So somehow those individuals that before the pandemic didn't really include e-shopping in their usual choices. So this actually makes the potential perseverance of this pattern more likely, because once somebody starts using a new service and there is the initial adoption, the friction of continuing to do that thing is actually lower. Delivery apps is an interesting thing. Maybe Mark, I would love to discuss more about this, because what we see in our analysis of who is doing these things, it's mainly popular among the young, urban, dynamic population in urban areas. It's also true that we see a strong correlation between the delivery apps, the use of delivery apps, and those that reduce the in-person dining in restaurants. So that actually makes us think that when the things will go back to more normal patterns, and as they are already doing with 2021, and actually I really want to dive into more adding to these, the results from the last wave that we just completed in summer 2021, my feeling is that I wouldn't be surprised if that frequency, at least, of the delivery apps will start to go down, and as things start to go back to normal. So a little bit more difference between the two patterns, with traditionally shopping and new on-demand delivery services. And finally, vehicle ownership. We haven't talked a lot in the previous presentation about vehicle ownership. I want to mention this because it's a very important issue. Vehicle ownership is not only important because, of course, the vehicle purchases during 2020, 2021 were heavily affected by, first, the psychological response and the lockdown to the pandemic, with a big drop in the number of vehicles that were sold. Then there was a rebound, but also there were huge supply issues that increased prices. So it's really difficult in this case to distinguish the supply from the demand. But the issue that is here is that we see a pretty strong increased interest in vehicle ownership among those individuals that were living in zero vehicle households. And this is translating among those that were living in zero vehicle household or low vehicle owning households. Among those that were doing it by choice, so I'm not talking about those by necessity, they cannot afford a car. Of course, it's a different story, it's an equity issue, but it's not a market issue. When we look at those that are doing by choice, many of them started buying their first vehicle in the household or moved from having only one vehicle in the household to two vehicles in the household, for example, if you're two adults. And that is actually something that could have quite a bit of impact in the medium term, because of course the higher vehicle access in the household might actually generate easier travel by car in the future. So
can you finish up in 2 minutes?
I will do my best. I don't need to stress, like, the differences in the adoption of telework in the different income categories. And so these slides show really our longitudinal data showing, like, the changes that were happening among the different groups of workers. But the next slides, I really want to show some major differences in 6 big groups that we identified. Among those, there were commuting during the pandemic and kept commuting. They were commuting before the pandemic and kept commuting during the pandemic. Those that adopted telework during the pandemic, those that actually started to commute in person, those that were not commuting before and after. And this slide is really shown using data from 2019 versus 2020, only for the SCAG region, the greater Los Angeles area. The results are very consistent when we look at other regions of the country. We did it for simplicity now. This analysis assembled for the Los Angeles region, mainly for sample size. And the thing I want to point is that if we look at the differences in these groups, they are striking in the characteristics of this individual. I want just to point, and for those that are interested, we have a working paper accepted for TRB presentation, and we are in the process of publishing in the journal, really discussing these different patterns, in particular the adoption of telework that was much higher among the better educated, but also the urban population that tended to be already having more urban lifestyles, but also very different patterns among the others. And we are started looking at the changes in frequency by mode, purpose, and the use of various type of transportation by groups to really identify who is responsible for these trips. We started interested how really, like, some individuals were really responsible for the bulk of the reduction in commuting trips, while there, for example, there is a general, like, patterns in non-commuting travel, so that can be seen among a lot of different groups of individuals. So wrapping up, we mentioned about the expectation for when the pandemic is over. Our results are largely in line with what other studies future. Our data show that on average is roughly 2 days a week is what the individuals expect to do after the pandemic is over. But one thing I want to stress really is that a lot of our data, and this is not a criticism to our study or RAM study or Mark study, I would say that every study I've seen so far during the pandemic is even based on online survey data or perhaps phone interviews. And these studies seem to systematically overrepresent individuals that were able to telework during the pandemic, but even before. And with Ram and Pat Mokhtar and other great colleagues, we've been discussing extensively. I had a conversation with Deborah just last week, Deborah Salon. We are trying to use the ACS data or NHTS or any kind of information to try to reweight based not on social demographics, but also on the ability to work from home before the pandemic. But the reality is that sometimes even ACS data, they have a very, very vague definition of who was teleworking before the pandemic because of their usual mode of commute that they use. So in our study, we are also doing now quite a bit of paper surveys and stratify random sample of the true population to really try to quantify that potential bias. And really try to show, like, how we could correct this data, also to account for potential overs. VNT is back. Peak travel is still below in many areas, in particular during the AM peak. So I would say the pandemic seems to be buying us some time to fight congestion, but clearly these patterns are coming back, and so probably like, we have 1-2 more years or some more time to make policy decisions that are important, but still very important, that consider that things are coming back in a different way, but also a lot of the problems will be back also during the peak time, most likely, also as the regions grow and more workers will need to travel around. I will pause here. We have our great team here, but also I want to point to our website where you can find a lot of information on this study, and I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Giovanni. Yeah, these slides will be available to everybody. So Carol says we can go a little bit longer in the Q&A. So if anyone has any questions for Giovanni or Ram or myself, go ahead. Don't see any hands raised at the moment. There's one in the chat box from Alex Bettinardi about if the weighting includes occupation type or industry type.
Yes. So I don't know which survey Alex was asking about, but our COVID future survey does cover a wide range of occupation types, and we did use that as a control variable. I just couldn't fit all the controls in one slide to show the full table, but we did control at a somewhat aggregate level.
Yeah, in our survey, we added education level as a control, and that seemed to help. So that the extent of teleworking we saw matched like federal Department of Labor surveys and things like that. So we didn't seem to be getting too much teleworking in our survey, at least early on. I don't know we haven't redone that lately. But no, it would be a fair amount of work to do by industry type because you'd have to use a different data source for that, but it might be a good idea.
Yeah, and in our data also we use we don't use the exact industry type. As Mark said, it would be quite a bit of fair amount of work, but we use employment, we use education, we use all other social demographics, and we use the ability to the work from home status before the pandemic. So using to rescale based on that.
Mm-hmm. Any further questions? Just a comment for Giovanni. I would be interested to see what you find about the delivery services, especially grocery, food delivery for your next wave, because I thought too that it would go down, but it didn't seem to go down. And we actually saw during the early months of COVID a lot of older people using grocery delivery. Maybe they were more worried about being catching or being infected, but so we haven't looked at that by age group lately.
Yeah, I would love to follow up on that, Mark. Our data, I need to look into the age distribution. Certainly it's a pretty urban phenomenon, and higher educated, higher income for the app-based delivery. For the e-shopping has gone much more into the non-traditional users, so older individuals, non-urban residents, and so on. So we saw quite a bit of an uptick in traditionally shopping, Amazon, let's say, and the type of services, in particular in correlation with those that said that were non-traditional users and they were concerned about the impact of the pandemic on health. And so more senior individuals and those that wanted to avoid contact in shops. But for the delivery apps, mainly urban phenomenon among the higher educated, higher income, the typical early adopters, I would say. But I would be interested, happy to follow up about the continuing patterns in new wave of data.
Let's see, any other questions out from the audience? Or from the panel? I know it was a lot of information to take in a short amount of time. So and yeah, it will be interesting over the coming year, and so to keep comparing the results from these surveys and other ones that are happening to get a coherent story. You always want to see, evidence from more than one study before you actually believe it. So the more things agree, the more confident we can be. But I still don't think we can really predict what's going to happen myself as we come out of the pandemic, partly because we can't really predict what's going to happen with the pandemic itself, which could also change things quite a bit. So any closing comments along those lines from Ram or Giovanni?
No, indeed. That's why I had in my last slide, time will tell how things will evolve. I still think there's a little bit of a disconnect perhaps between workers and employers with respect to the extent of working from home. So it'll be interesting to see where they meet in the middle. But I expect that we will see on any given day certainly a 10 to 15% higher level of telecommuting, post-pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what's going to happen with the really long-range telecommuting, like people who work hundreds of miles away from their workplace.
Yeah, right. So you'll have more remote workers.
Yeah, and apart from the commuting, that is an interesting question. I think there are some other forms like work-related travel that will be impacted in the longer term. I mean, we see today how meetings, for example, with clients or partners and so on, are much more accepted online, and I think that will stay with us. I don't really foresee having to travel all the time to go to meet the agencies with which we work in person all the time in the future, as we used to do before the pandemic. I used to do probably once a week. I was in Sacramento almost once a week from Davis here. It's only a few miles, but we don't need to do it anymore. We just do a call. And I see that is not really commuting trips. There's a lot of work-related travel that is changing. And I think that will have certainly of course, percentage-wise, it's much smaller than the number of commuting trips, but that will be something that, for example, is probably here to stay. I also think the other thing Mark was mentioning, the long distance telecommuters. I think another thing to monitor that will be very interesting is the evolution in the real estate. We're already seeing the use of office space as being slightly reorganized in many companies. I mean, perhaps California is an exception. The economy of certain states in the US, Washington State, California, and others, with the presence of the computer industry, it's particularly an exception, but it's a big sector, and we see already using a lot more of form of flexibility in the office space, and just the square footage per employee starting to be different because companies reorganize their organization and will also want to optimize their budget sheet in the end.